All right, I think we're going to get cracking now. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second last webinar of this series. My name is Heidi Lenffer, and I work as a research analyst with the Ecotone Partners team. And I'm also the appointed webinar master of this series. So it's been my great joy to be chatting to a variety of wonderful practitioners from around the world. And today will be no exception. So before I go further, I just want to acknowledge I'm calling in from Darug country, which is in the Blue Mountains. It's a beautiful sunny day here. So I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Darug people, and pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to extend this respect to any First Nations people we have on the call today. So the topic today is investing in women to drive climate solutions. The pivotal role of gender equality for solving the climate crisis. Gender equality, climate crisis, easily two of the most complex challenges of our time. And I think we're all quite used to treating these topics as separate, huge thematics because there's already so much depth and nuance to each of them. But the point of today's webinar is to really start unpacking the ways that these mammoth topics intersect and find out why it's important for us as impact-driven investors to understand how integrating both gender and climate considerations is key for unlocking greater impact. So our panelists today have a lot of experience with straddling both of these worlds in their line of work, and they're very alive to the reality of how these intersecting dynamics play out in real life, real world situations across the fields of philanthropy, government, venture capital, and institutional investing as well. So we have a lot to learn from them. And if questions pop up for you during the chat, please pop them in the little chat window because we're going to allow for probably 10 minutes of question time at the end. Now I'm going to hand over to our moderator for today's session, our dear friend and colleague, Amanda Goodman, who is the co-founder and director of Ecotone Partners. Amanda has over 20 years of experience across financial services and the non-profit sector, and has been at the forefront of impact investing in Australia for much of the past decade. Her most recent role was as head of capital raising and investor relations at Impact Investment Group, where she helped raise over 700 million of investor capital and developed a number of industry first impact funds in Australia, including our first 100% impact focused VC fund. She's a Harvard graduate who cut her teeth in finance at Goldman Sachs, working in the US as well as the UK. She's been a principal in a UK-based venture capital firm, but fortunately for us, her passion for using finance as a force for good has landed her in Australia and set her on path to founding Ecotone Partners. So we're lucky to have her today. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Heidi. Thanks for the really kind introduction, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I've been really excited about this webinar, and I'm excited to be moderating it today. And as Heidi mentioned, I've spent much of the last decade in impact investing. So I feel like over that time, I've gotten a really deep appreciation and understanding of climate investing, and that's what we do at Ecotone Partners, where we spend most of our time connecting startups and companies with climate solutions to investors who are aligned. And I've also spent quite a bit of time understanding gender lens investing. But it's only more recently that I've started appreciating the intersectionality of those two big thematics. So I'm really keen in today's webinar to go on this journey with everyone who's attending and do a bit of a deeper dive with our speakers to really flesh out what this is all about, why it's important to understand how climate impacts are differentially experienced by women, and why women might have a different lens in relation to climate issues and climate investing as well. And I also want to spend some time today talking about how we can think about the role different types of capital play in the investment context when it comes to integrating gender and climate. So those are the two broad areas I want to focus on. We're going to start out by really framing the situation and diving deep into how these two issues are related, why it's important, and then we're going to spend some time asking our panelists, so what do we do about this? You know, what does it mean we need to change about how we think about investing, how we practice investing? and how we make investment decisions. And I'm really delighted to have an amazing panel of incredible women helping us unpick some of these issues. And I will briefly introduce them before we get going. First, I'd like to introduce Michelle Higelin. Michelle is the Executive Director of ActionAid Australia, an NGO working to combat poverty and injustice worldwide. She has more than 2.5 decades of experience working to advance women's rights in Australia and internationally, including as the former Deputy General Secretary of the World YWCA, one of the largest women's rights movements globally. And Michelle has served on global advisory groups to the UN, the World Food Programme. She also chaired the NGO Working Group on Peace at the United Nations in Geneva. She currently serves on a few boards, the board of the Australian Council for International Development, and she is co-chair of the Australian Civil Society Coalition on Women, Peace and Security. So welcome, Michelle. Next, we have Christina Hobbs joining us. Christina is the CEO and co-founder of Verve, which some of you might be familiar with. Verve is Australia's first ethical investing community for women by women. And the Verve group includes a women's focused super fund called Verve Super, as well as an ethical investing platform, Verve Money. Christine is an experienced board director in the super industry and is also a published author on gender equality. And before founding Verve and working in the super industry, she spent over a decade with the UN as a humanitarian financial inclusion expert. So very relevant experience for our conversation today. And last but certainly not least, we've got Zarmeen Pavri. Zarmeen is one of the co-founders and chief impact officer of SDGX, an impact VC investment management and advisory firm, where she manages a global climate tech impact fund. She is also currently the Oceania regional head for GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, and also serves on a variety of boards, including You Ethical Investors. She's also the chair of the Ethical and Impact Committee for one of Apostle Funds Management's funds, the Diversified People and Planet Fund, and was also previously a director of an ASX-listed company, Manus Energy Technologies. She's worked in the international development sector and was an impact fund manager for DFAT's Social Impact Accelerator Fund. And prior to transitioning to the world of impact, she held several senior executive leadership positions within funds management across both equities and alternative investing. So very, very experienced, and delighted to welcome you, Zarmeen. All right. So with that, let's get into the substance. And I thought maybe before we start exploring the intersectionality of climate and gender, I thought it'd be good just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing and we all understand what we're talking about when it comes to gender lens investing. We've spent a bit of time on this in previous webinars, and in fact, in one of our previous webinars on this series, we focused specifically on gender lens investing and what it means. But I thought, just to make sure we're all on the same page, Christina, if you could kick us off by just giving us a bit of a definition about of gender lens investing, and then perhaps following on with some high-level thoughts about how it intersects with climate.
Yeah, thanks. I noticed that I do quite a few of these talks, but I noticed there is a bit of confusion and discussion, and so I think it is good to sort of, I guess, clarify at the beginning what we're talking about. But there's really two elements to how I personally think about gender-based investing, and that's really the outcomes that your investment decisions are trying to achieve, and that is investing with a gender lens to make certain that we are promoting women and girls and thinking about other forms of gender diversity and inclusion as well. And then the second part is around the investment process. So on the former, it's really thinking about how can we invest in women-led businesses and businesses owned by women? How can we invest in enterprises that promote workplace equality? How can we invest in enterprises that are offering products and services that substantially improve the lives of women and girls and gender diverse people? And on the process side, it's really thinking through how do we develop robust investment processes to ensure that we are including these factors across all investment decisions that we make? And how do we ensure as well that the investment committees and the investment groups that we're associated with also represent that form of gender diversity? And for me personally, when I think about how it intersects with climate, it's quite interesting because when we started Verve, that was really our question. How do we create a fund that's for climate and for sustainability, but also for gender? And I guess the process we really, or the things that we really thought about is where do these things intersect? So, and where are they separate? So we do our investment in sustainability, we do our investments in gender, and then we also think about that intersection. And that intersection for me is really around the role that women and girls can play in climate solutions and ensuring that they're at the table when we make those decisions, including investment decisions. It's about ensuring that we are promoting efforts where that support women and girls in terms of building their recovery and their resilience to climate change, because we know that they'll be the groups most impacted as well. So, and there's other intersections as well, but they're probably the most important ones for me.
Great, thanks, Christina. And Zarmeen, maybe, I know from our previous conversations, this is an area you're particularly passionate about, and you can tell when you speak to it, you light up. So can you share with our audience some initial thoughts on why considering the intersection of gender and climate is particularly important, and why now?
Yeah, sure. Yes, that passion will come out, I'm sure, with all of us on this call. Probably the first thing, why now? Well, there's climate right on our doorstep, but I sort of wanted to unpack a little bit this intersectionality and cross-sectionality, and I really wish that the UN Sustainable Goals, number 5, gender equality, wasn't a vertical. And it should have been a cross-section across all of those SDGs. So someone had told me, picked me up on intersectionality, and the way I was talking was cross-sectionality, and so that for me is a really big lens that I use across anything that I do, constantly looking at gender, and yes, the intersection comes about, but climate change is not gender neutral. So we know that gender inequality in the context of climate change disproportionately impacts women and girls who are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change in the first place, but who will experience worse outcomes as a result of it. So now is the imperative. So if I had to connect some of the dots and share with you a really sad reality, and I know Michelle will cover off on a lot more. Let's take an example. One of 200 million adolescent girls in the world's poorest communities, and explore how inequalities translate for her. So she may live in a rural community. She's very dependent on natural resources, made increasingly scarce by climate change. She may be forced to drop out of school, and she will never even attend, or she may not even attend. She needs to collect water and support the household. Now, as the burden of the household increases, and without education, skills, financial independence, she's most likely to get married off early, becoming one of 700 million women today who are married before the age of 18. It gets better or worse. According to IMF research, an average female participation in the workforce is 20 percentage points lower than our male counterparts. And that's largely because of persistent lack of opportunities, particularly accessing education. Cultural barriers, economic stress, lack of education, gender norms, it goes on. So now we have our adolescent girl who is now a wife, a mother, and responsible for securing food, water, fuel, and her family. Now, rising temperatures, decreasing rainfall will make this harder and prevent her from participating in the economy, her community, and decision-making. And she may even take her children out of school to help. So she faces unequal access to resources. She can't even access, at times, across some of the countries, access to land and credit. And so if she had that ability, she and other women could actually easily more adapt to the climate trends and withstand some of these climate shocks. So women play an importantly, major role in the economy and life in society, agricultural sector, etc. So we could go on and on about all of the inequalities, but and I'm sure Michelle will definitely share her views in a much more grassroots manner. But women and girls are more likely to suffer from the food shortages, the poor hygiene, everything, all the aftermaths of the disasters and gender-based violence, and it goes on. So that's the pessimistic picture and a real sad reality for women and girls around the world. So we cannot tackle climate change with any climate solutions effectively unless we place gender inclusion front and center. That's my personal view. And I'm happy to discuss as we go through the practical application of how we do that and how we are doing this to include women and participate in that transition to that inclusive and green economy.
Thanks, Salmeen. And I do remember when reading the book Drawdown, some of you might have read, the most important thing, the most important intervention we can make in solving the climate problem is actually investing in women and girls. And I remember being quite surprised at that. But when you step through that logic, it makes a lot of sense. Now, Michelle, you've got some firsthand experience having worked kind of on the ground with women, particularly those who are most vulnerable in low-income communities. So I want to ask you about some of the foundational connection points we need to understand here, drawing from your own personal experience. And what first led you to start drawing these connections between gender and climate, either with your work at ActionAid or earlier in your career? If you could just help flesh that out for us a little bit.
Sure. And if I can also just add, just building on what Zarmeem has said, that, the latest UN Women Gender Snapshot tells us that gender disparities are worsening as a result of cascading global crises, including climate change, and that we are really at this moment at a tipping point for gender equality and women's rights, and that unless there is investment, gender equality will take more than 300 years to achieve at global rates of progress. And definitely for ActionAid, we started to draw these connections between gender and climate more than a decade ago. And we're seeing the very things that Zarmeem talks about firsthand in our programming. And so, things like, countries in Africa experiencing prolonged drought due to climate change, definitely that was accompanied with increases in early marriage, girls dropping out of school, increased reports of violence. And right now we see extreme poverty growing among women, particularly in the Horn of Africa. So, I think it's fair to say that where gender inequities are present in normal times, they magnify in times of crisis. And we did a piece of work with the Economist Intelligence Unit to particularly do a deep dive into South Asia and, looking at, I guess the differences between men and women's resilience to crisis. And this had two, I think, very important findings that are good to understand in this context. The first is that there are this range of intersecting social, economic, institutional and infrastructure challenges that result in women having less resilience to men. And so, for example, that's everything from access to finance and savings, even access to transport, whether or not there are gender responsive laws and policies and services in place, as well as the broader status of women in society. So that's one important thing, that this is a complex picture and there are a range of factors that intersect. And the second one, and which is perhaps more important, is this vicious cycle that in times of crisis where women are shut out of decision-making on climate change and disasters, the result is that policy and plans are gender blind. And they also failed to either prioritise or take into account the very specific needs that women have in response to climate change. So when disaster strikes, they're plunged further into poverty and inequality. And a really clear example of this is, only 2% of all resources in humanitarian response go into responding to the prevention of gender-based violence in emergencies. Yet we know this is prevalent in every single crisis. So there is this real resource gap that's failing to address the priorities that are fundamental to, stopping crisis driving gender inequality.
Great, thanks. And Michelle, are there any personal experiences you've had on the ground that kind of come to mind when you think about this intersectionality?
Yeah. Look, I think that one of the most stark moments in my memory was back in 2016, where a small group of us went into a meeting of Pacific governments looking at the region's climate change strategy. And in the room were all the heads of the National Disaster Management Office. Every single one was a man, and the only women in the room were those taking notes. So not only was there absolutely no conversation about gender and climate change, I think the fact that women were completely marginalised and excluded in this space. And definitely for ActionAid, I mean, this was a pivotal moment for us in looking at how we could shift power in this sort of context. And that led us to establish the Arise Fund. And this aims to scale up investment in women's leadership in preparing for and responding to crisis with a strong focus on the Asia Pacific region. And it's based on this very sound investment logic that for every $1 we invest in disaster preparedness, we save $7 in a humanitarian response. And also that investing in women's leadership not only delivers tangible outcomes in making sure communities are better prepared, but it also can serve as a catalyst for broader outcomes in terms of gender equality. And, that's trained more than 30,000 women. It's supported, responses in over 19 countries, led by women that have reached more than 2.5 million people. It's definitely more of that sort of philanthropy grant-based capital. So it's at the different end of the investment spectrum. But that's one of the things that really motivated that work.
So because women are differentially impacted by climate, I guess they've got a unique lens with which to help address those climate challenges.
Yes, definitely.
Great. And I think that plays out in the investment context as well, in terms of women having an important role to play in directing flows of capital as well. So maybe if we can shift gears a little bit now and consider how some of these learnings can be applied in the investment context for different types of players in the investment ecosystem. So let's spend some time talking about how this relationship can be embedded in investment decision making and influence things like portfolio construction. And maybe Christina, if I can turn to you to kick off this conversation. You're the CEO of a super fund for women. And it'd be great if you could share with us some practical examples of how Verve went about doing this and building an investment grade portfolio that kind of meets the requirements of an institutional super fund, but also then overlaying a gender and climate focus.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, it was a really interesting challenge because I think one of the reasons I started Verve was because I had been working internationally on these projects and I felt really excited by what finance was starting to do. There was so many interesting microfinance projects that were happening globally that were supporting women in this space, that were doing good things. I felt there was a lot happening, and then sort of coming back to Australia, it felt really behind in terms of where the discussion was. And I think the starting point for us was, because I had been on the board of another ethical super fund, and at that time it really struck me as just crazy that there was no ethical super fund in Australia that was really taking a gender lens approach to how it invested. So of course, we still see this today, when there's major events in the in the news about companies have done the wrong thing, we see sort of reactionary responses to those by some of the big super funds when they're really major events. But there was no fund that had a really strong gender, I guess, criteria in terms of how they invested. So for us, we knew that we wanted to have the sustainability and the climate lens. We knew we wanted the gender lens. We wanted both of those things. And we also wanted to find opportunities where we could invest in women directly solving climate solutions. So I guess maybe going through some of the challenges that we had in doing this. So the first was that we came up with screening for gender. How do we want to think about gender? And we developed a gender indexed based on using the WGEA data that was available in Australia to rank companies based on how they're performing on gender equality. So that was anything from how many women in leadership to leave policies. And we decided to use that to invest in Australian equities. And one of the reasons we did that was because the climate focused or the sustainability focused ETFs or indexes that we had been used didn't have that gender lens. So first of all, we had to find a way of investing in equities. And we had this problem from both sides where we would love to have invested in some of the climate ETFs or some of the existing indexes if they would take a gender consideration. And we would have been loved to invest in some of the emerging gender lens focused indexes and ETFs if they had as well. So we have this problem from both directions. So globally and in the US, there's some really emerging, interesting gender focused ETFs, but none of them yet are screening on broader criteria. So we have this issue where we would love to be supporting them and channeling money into them, but they're still investing in fossil fuels and it doesn't match our other mandate. So part of our role, I guess, in the ecosystem was to go to some of those funds and ETF providers on the sustainability side and said, hey, we would love to invest in you, but we care about gender. Like, can you accommodate that? And we did it on the other side for the gender side as well. And what was actually interesting was that before we launched Verve Super, we were able to convince beta shares or have a role in convincing and working with beta shares that had an ethical ETF we were interested in to put at least one gender screen on how they're investing from which was not to invest in companies that had a woman on the board. So in that way, we were able to have a small impact on a sustainability focused ETF to also include gender. So for us, this was the first kind of step in building the portfolio, was to make certain that we could include considerations from both sides, just in terms of our divestment screening, do no harm screening. Then it was, well, how do we invest for impact? And so today where it stands is we have impact investments. We are acutely focused on finding impact investments that have a climate focused and a women focus. And in terms of investments that are suitable at a superannuation level, there's very, very few available. I think we've made one or two. And so primarily our impact investing is then separated, is based on initiatives that either support climate or initiatives that support women. And then we see our role in the ecosystem is really to support players, funds that are trying to emerge, that want to have this intersection at their heart to bring them to market. So what that practically means is that people are approaching us all the time with ideas around funds. And when we see those particular ones where the idea or the very heart of what they're trying to achieve is around bringing women into climate solutions or focusing on resilience of women to climate change, we then work with them on discussing how they could look at structuring those funds for superannuation. We look at supporting them on what the journey would need to look like to get superannuation investment. And the role that we really see that Verve can play is, while we don't have the hundreds of millions and the billions that a HESTA or an Australian super can be, we can really see our role as potentially being the first superannuation fund to seed some of these funds and to work with them to bring their funds up to a level that they could receive superannuation money, to be their first example of that money, and that therefore hopefully through that success they can then go and chase larger superannuation money. And so for us, it's been a real journey to work out where we sit and the role that we can play as a small superannuation fund. But it's not easy, and I think it's an area where product is still emerging, and particularly from a superannuation space where you're looking for very, I guess, precise, those particular options have to be quite precise in terms of how they fit into your overall fund. So I think that, being really clear as an investor and where you sit in the ecosystem, and I think that high net worth individuals, family offices can play that role sort of before super, to help get some of these funds off the ground, start investing in them, allow them to get that track record so that they can then come in and get superannuation money. But the one or two examples where we have been able to do this is housing initiatives focused on women that have an intersection with climate resilience, and also in microfinance projects focused on agriculture, where there's a focus on women. And we know that that through supporting, by channeling our superannuation money into those microfinance projects, that we're able to support that particular fund and that particular nonprofit to work with women agriculturalists in the Asia Pacific to build up their resilience to climate-based shocks. So I'll leave it there.
Great. I feel like I want to go in a couple different directions here, but really
it was a lot.
Yeah. But I mean, the reality is that, you're a steward of capital on behalf of, your members, and to be able to reflect their values in those investment decisions, I would think is really important. And I don't think that's necessarily something that a lot of, super funds, generally speaking, have thought much time about. And then particularly the role you can play in developing product in the space, because there is new product coming online all the time, but it's slow and we need more. So to have people like yourselves in the marketplace supporting that new product, I think is really important. Just out of curiosity, some of the headwinds in being able to do that, I'd imagine some of the new regulations imposed on, super funds are making that challenging. Can you speak to that just for a minute or two before?
Yeah, it's really, it's an interesting space. I think with the recent change of government, we might see a bit of movement, but the real challenges that we've had is some of the very specific legislative pieces around super. So one is that we have to invest in the best financial interests of our members, which is, definitely makes sense. But how that is viewed at a more granular level can be challenging. So when it comes to some of these investments that are really impact focused, we've had to make really heartbreaking decisions in the past where we're like, we love this fund, we know it's going to return, but actually if we look at the risk profile for the level of return profile, and we look at how the legislation wants us to make these decisions, it's inappropriate for us to invest in that product. That's sort of what's always been in the background. But the kind of recent changes that have come in around benchmarking have been incredibly challenging. So anyone that sort of has a more detailed understanding of ethical investing, as many of your listeners will know that ethical funds, if you look at the RIA reports, they tend to outperform over the long term because they sort of have a more consistent return. So you don't kind of get the highs, but the lows, you tend not to sink as deep. And so that's sort of the power of ethical investing and why over the long term those funds do outperform. But with the new benchmarking rules that have been brought in and how superannuation funds are assessed, it's really about bringing everyone in line with the same strategy. Because, for instance, and this is a really classic moment for us in history right now, where we aren't investing in fossil fuels, we are investing in renewable energy products. We have this war in Ukraine going on, so we're seeing surging fossil fuel prices. And we're seeing some of the renewable energy projects.
Oh, you hit mute, Christina. Sorry, Christina, you
hit
mute.
Just popped on mute. Sorry, I must have hit it.
Just 10 seconds ago.
Okay, yeah. So I was sort of talking about the current situation that we're in, and with as an ethical fund, we know that over the long term, our investment strategy not to invest in fossil fuels, we believe that's in the financial interest of our members. We have no doubt that strategy over the 20, 30-year time period that we're investing in their super is the correct one from a returns perspective. But right now, if you compare us to other funds, we're not doing well because fossil fuel prices are surging and we're not invested in them. And in the old world, that wouldn't matter so much. But in the world of benchmarking, we're suddenly very significantly below the benchmark. We're at risk of being pulled out because of that performance. And so there's sort of this scary trend where on one hand, the government wants superannuation funds to be taking climate into consideration, and they've got timeframes around that. But on the other hand, the leaders in this space are then at risk of that benchmarking performance. So it's a really challenging time to be in this space in super, and I'm hoping that we'll see some changes to that benchmarking regulation to allow funds to be more innovative and being rewarded for that, not punished.
Great. And so, I mean, it's clear you're working in a constrained environment, and you did touch upon earlier the role that private investors can play. Do you want to just maybe spend 30 seconds just digging into that a little bit more? I guess they don't have those same constraints.
Yeah, I can give an excellent example. So there's two women I know was trying to start a fund to invest in female founders. A lot of those, and all the female founders are investing in have impact-based businesses. It's an innovative model where it's revenue-based financing, so they don't take a huge chunk of equity, they take profit back and return interest. It looks great for us from a profile perspective. We've got real trust in them. But as a superannuation fund, our investment committee has deemed it too high risk to invest in a fund that doesn't have a track record of performance. Fair enough. What we would like to see is a bunch of private investors come in, back that fund for 1 or 2 years. That could be $500,000, it could be $1 million, it could be a $2 million fund. And then super funds like us could come in on the back of that with our millions, showing that they've got that track record of performance. And so that, I think, is the relationship between us and private investors, and where private investors can play that critical role in helping some of these innovative products get off the ground.
Great, thank you. And I think we've also seen that globally in terms of impact investing, where the private investors and private markets really spearhead the establishment and kind of the initial track record of some of these funds and products, and then more institutional forms of capital can come in. So let's shift gear a bit and talk about another type of institutional capital. Zarmeen, I mean, your background spans many different areas in the investment world. You've raised capital, designed products, managed funds, advised governments. You've been an entrepreneur yourself. And, you know, it'd be great to understand a bit more from your perspective how you've seen the integration of climate and gender in the investment context, both broadly, but also now that you're running a climate-focused VC fund. You know, how do you think about the intersectionality of climate and gender in the context of VC investing?
Yeah, yes, I've had the benefit of doing that helicopter view and being immersed in many different ways in the economy. Look, at the general level, I think we'll start with that representation. Representation matters at all levels, going to Michelle's point earlier. And so there's a lot of focus within the investment community of, board representation and female representation at management levels. And they are fantastic starting points. And I'll go down to why it's exceptionally important, especially even for passive investing, and the unintended consequences of government policy for superannuation funds. The ability to look, as Christina said, on gender is going to be very key for that. So generally we are not seeing, well, I haven't seen too many professionals working at the intersection. We're still constantly seeing climate products and climate solutions and gender, and we're not seeing too many intersectionality aspects in the process, and that's the key, right? If the process is not going to create the outcomes, then it's rubbish in, rubbish out. So from a general perspective, we're seeing great movements by super funds, by investment managers, etc., on looking at female representation on boards and management levels. And one of the exciting things that I've come across just recently is some exciting research that's come out from the European Central Bank. And so because we're a global firm from Europe, Asia and Australia, we see lots of new great things and applying it. So there's an actual ECB report that was released in February 22, which actually started to look at, does gender diversity in the workplace mitigate climate change? And now that's a super interesting lens or research. And what it did reveal, and it's actually added to our theory of change, and continues to do so, is that because very little attention's been devoted so far on companies' gender diversity and CO2 emissions, this paper is the first of its kind. It analysed the role that women play in managerial positions and in terms of containing a firm's level of carbon emissions. Now, they found that female managers were more inclined to towards environmental protection than their male peers. Now, how did it actually translate into actual CO2 reduction numbers? What's the data? So the study actually was quite big, 2,000 listed companies. So sample size is quite big in 24 industrial economies over a period of 2009 to 2019. Now, they found 1 percentage point increase in the share of female managers leads to 0.5% decrease in CO2 emissions. But what was even more impressive was the data and the results after the period of the Paris Agreement. It actually showed that firms with greater gender diversity at the management level reduce their CO2 emissions by 5% more than firms with more male managers. Now, that is how you climate proof your portfolio, just by looking at representation and going and doing a little bit more deeper dive than counting women on boards. And so there's real proof in coming out in that. So that is a really key insight into how we manage VC as well. For us, we are running a climate tech fund, and we are in deep tech, which is much more harder than just normal tech. It requires physical assets. We're focused in the energy, transport, and manufacturing production sectors, the biggest sectors that are producing the greenhouse gas emissions, and we're looking for climate solutions in deep tech. In deep tech, the characteristic is that it's based on science and engineering. Now let's look at that industry. So all of these startups, a lot of the ventures that we are looking at are predominantly male, because they're research scientists, professors coming out of the universities, engineers, etc. So in terms of practical ways as a VC that we're looking at it, we're looking at multiple different ways of addressing certain structural issues and problems. So from the VC space, you will see tons of new product coming out from existing managers. They're just looking at climate solutions, renewables, big plays. But as investors on this call and the community on this call, you really need to start asking the question, what about gender? Looking at their investment teams as a starting point. So I'm not sure you'll get the intended benefits of what climate and gender actually will deliver. So in terms of us and how we're looking at it, there are multiple different ways. So in the investment process, for instance, if we just, when we're looking at energy, transport, production, manufacturing, I think one of the speakers talked about, transport inequalities, safety on transports, planning structural things. We're constantly looking at even those three sectors. What's the gender-based analysis impacting these industries? That's our starting point as an investment professional. And we're also creating a screen for just greenhouse gas emissions. So these solutions need to, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 0.5 gigaton per annum within 10 years of our holding period. So that's the E. But what we're looking for in our ventures is impact multipliers, and gender is weighted quite heavily. And so in most VCs, we look at the team, we look at the founders, etc. So for us as VC, many times in my deal sourcing, I get lots and lots of pitch books. I basically flick to the back of the pitch book, which usually has the team. at the back or maybe the front, and I just look at the diversity on my my founder team or the executive management team or the board, etc. Now, first of all, if it's all male, I basically am indirectly putting an orange flag on my weighting sheet. And that's not to say it's screened out. It won't get screened out for that. But I recognize that I'm missing the diversity dividend that I just talked about. And I'm also missing out on 20 to 30% uplift in IRR just from having that diversity on the management team. But since reading that February report from ECB, I'm also losing out on a CO2 emissions reduction dividend. So, so those two things are orange flags, but we need to think about the just transition and also helping build capacity. So it just means for me that it's a flag to say that I need to help these startups or these ventures and develop their pipeline, the women's pipeline. So we have developed our own ecosystem where, you know, for impact investing, we have to use a systems lens and it requires radical collaboration. Now, collaborations is the key. Like traditional VCs, and you'll see them investing in climate, have a look at how big their ecosystem is. So our ecosystem with addressing structural features in engineering and science is that we've got MOU signed up with major universities. We've got a university alliance, the Climate Alliance, International Universities Climate Alliance, which has 56 global universities. And we are focused on helping women in research, applied research, doing mentoring, shaping how that translation gets to commercialization, all of that. Because when our ventures ask us for, hey, we're looking for staff as a CFO or etc., or an engineer or you know, a scientist to help in patent development of some of these technologies, we have got pipeline development already there to actually help from the recruitment process to enable that diversity of the management team and the execution, because the execution is key for us. So we've done that. And then, you know, at the DD stage, for instance, if we have this orange flag, which a lot of them do, we can actually put it in a term sheet that within 2 to 3 years, we would like to see executive management have a diverse team. That's part of it. So that will also force, but many of these ventures that we're looking at are quite already quite gender aware. So we haven't had difficult conversations, but that's another aspect. And then at the gender outcomes level, we're looking, as I mentioned, for these impact multipliers. And so, yes, our, you know, thematic is climate and deep tech in those sectors. It's B2B solutions mostly, but we are constantly looking out for the intersectionality. So for an example, in the energy sector, we have got a deep tech, sort of quasi deep tech solution that is focused on, it's an Australian-based company focused on a battery solar play with a mesh grid system and an IoT solution. And they've gone out to Nigeria, Cambodia, Haiti to address the last energy mile. Now, from the climate perspective and the greenhouse gas emissions perspective, they tick all the boxes. They've got gender on their teams. It's fantastic. What we looked out for from an opportunity set, so the risk was also mitigated. The opportunity set was a multiplier because they not only addressed the last energy mile in Nigeria, for instance, hardest market. I think 85 million people do not have energy access. 920 million people, I think globally, do not have energy access across the world. So they're cracking a big market. We are VC. What they did was they looked at the gender outcomes. They saw that health outcomes were, you know, established and enabled through electricity, renewable electricity for the women, their time to collect the wood, and you know, that was saved, access to appliances, electrical appliances, cooking time, all of that gender equality coming into play, educational outcomes for the children that can study in actual light, electricity light, rather than when it gets dark, they can't study. So there were multiple multipliers. So we did look at SDG number 13, SDG number 7, affordable and clean energy, but they had a cross section of SDG 5, gender equality. They had the multipliers of SDG 4 and 3, etc. And they're collecting the data because most people are on this globe, regardless of poverty at times, actually has a mobile phone, and they've created an app to collect the data. So when we talk about data being an issue, well, we're still using the mindset that we haven't got the technology to do it, and it's sitting right in front of us with a phone. So I might stop there, but that's how we're seeing it through our investment process, through our investment team, and also the gender outcomes and that cross multiplier for climate solutions.
Thanks. I mean, that's really helpful, and interesting parallels between what some of Christina's comments around how super capital can help develop the ecosystem and the products, and also equally relevant in the VC side, where you are seeing great climate solutions, all male teams, for example, that don't have any gender lens or any differential gender impacts as well. So great that you guys are helping develop that pipeline as well. And I do want to talk to Michelle a little bit about as well what you're seeing in terms of how integrating climate and gender work best in practice in your field. You're coming at the problem from a unique perspective, where you've got that firsthand experience on the ground, working with women by and large at the coalface of a lot of these issues. So, if you could just talk to us about how you've seen that work well in practice in the context of ActionAid.
Yeah, look, and building on our work in sort of very diverse contexts like Kenya, Cambodia, Vanuatu, we have worked to develop I guess a consistent global response to how we can tackle these sort of twin elements of gender and climate. And definitely at the heart of this agenda is women's leadership, as Zamim has spoken to. If we are to address growing inequality as a result of the climate change, we need to invest in women's leadership, and that is at all levels of decision making. It's the formal decision making spaces, but it's also where resource decisions are made. And I think that's particularly important for the context of thinking about this as an investment area. But there are also three other factors which are important, I think, to be thinking about, and that we found. One is how we can recognise the local and the Indigenous knowledge that women bring to the table that has been marginalised, but yet can be harnessed for effective climate solutions, particularly alongside the science and the technology. One of the most effective early warning mechanisms we've supported is a Pacific women-led innovation that came out of Fiji, is now reaching 40% of the population in Vanuatu and 1.8 million people in Papua New Guinea. So we can draw on this sort of Indigenous knowledge to really have effective locally led solutions. And another area that's important is looking at how we can invest in women's collectives, networks and organisations. As this is critical to lifting the status of women across the board, rather than this sort of sole focus on the individual woman entrepreneur. Definitely there's decades of research that show that kind of investment will have long-term change for gender equality. And the third thing that's really important is that we're also looking at those harmful gender norms that continue to fuel gender inequality in times of crisis. So for example, when we're looking at increasing access to finance, how are we also looking at who makes decisions in the household? Because if we're just giving money to women without actually supporting their greater control and access over resources, then we're not actually really addressing the bigger fundamental issue that stops and sort of impacts on women's resilience in times of crisis. So what we see when these, four things are present: women's leadership, knowledge, networks, and gender norm change. This is how we can start to reverse some of those harmful impacts of climate change on women and girls.
Great, thanks, Michelle. I am just conscious of time. We've got a few minutes left. We do have a couple questions. Also, just for the record, Zalmeen, we've had a couple of requests for a link to that research, so we will distribute that after.
Yes, I put it in the text chat, but
Right.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
we'll also circulate it
Perfect.
by way of follow-up. We've had a question come in around if any of you have ever seen impact carry incentives to fund managers where there's been kind of differential carry based on impact achieved in either climate or gender. Have you seen examples, and is it a feasible idea?
I have certainly seen the intent. There is very little sharing on how to structure it. Some of the issues around that, and we need to keep in mind in traditional funds management, we have carries and hurdles, and there's gaming that can be done. So hurdles, let's think about that. What benchmark are you going to use? And I'm talking about impact benchmarks. I'm not talking about the MSCI and the sustainability stuff, because that's not going to cut it for impact, and it needs to be longitudinal. So when we're thinking about performance fees and carries, then the whole structure needs to change about long term, because impact is long term. It's not about outputs. There's a difference between outputs, outcomes, and impact. So I don't think the marketplace can ask for it from a fund manager, but I don't think the marketplace actually understands how, you know, they thought about it too much. So the unintended consequences, let's see, if I use and lowball a benchmark, credit worthiness of, you know, if I was a healthcare fund, I should be looking at the George Institute for data. Maybe instead of some other little research house that may have done some, you know, some research. The cost of impact measurement. So if we want to get remunerated for fees, we also have to ask investors, you know, there is a cost to doing all of this analysis. So how do we compensate for that? But there's a lot of talk around it, but I haven't seen a case study on showing how it can be done, because more than likely the outcome and the impact hasn't been achieved yet to be able to do the calculation if it's a real, you know, impact deal. Because some of the things that Michelle and we're talking about, you know, you can't measure a woman's livelihood, you know, increase in income in 6 months, 12 months, 5 years, 3 years. You're probably exited by that time. So there's lots of talk. I think that there's good intention. Skin in the game is the most likely way you can actually really do the alignment, which is a pretty real game. But we have to think about all of the traditional marketplace that has looked at remuneration.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Thank
that
you,
applies here.
Zalmeen. Christina, have you seen it? Just very briefly. I don't know. You went off mute,
No,
so I don't know.
I was really interested in that answer to hear if it was being done. I've heard talk of it, but no, I haven't seen it. But would love to see it. Would love to see an innovative approach to it, I think.
All right. I'm afraid that
concept.
Sorry, Christina. No, I think we'd all welcome seeing some of that. So let's keep looking. I'm afraid that is all we have time for, and apologies if we didn't get to ask your question. Heidi, I might just hand over to you to wrap up.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. So interesting. Thank you very much to all the speakers today, and Amanda for moderating, and everyone for coming along. Just a final thank you to DFAT as well. So this is, as I mentioned, this is the second last webinar in this series. So I really hope you can join us for our final one. It's going to be good. It's in a month's time on November 15th. And we'll be showcasing 3 really exciting, innovative, high impact gender and climate investment opportunities in the Asia Pacific region. So it'll be a fun showcase that you won't want to miss. And it'll be really a real opportunity to give you some options if you want to move capital into these exciting impact opportunities. So yeah, please come along. Thanks everyone, and have a great week. Bye.
Thanks so much, Heidi.
Very much. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.